Good morning. I'm Barbara Guth, a member of the Adult Education Council at Westminster Presbyterian Church. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Leon Rodrigues. He is a Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Luther Seminary, CEO for Global Horizons, and a licensed minister with Interministerial Fellowship. Today, Dr. Rodrigues will reflect on his experience with apartheid in South Africa. He will discuss what parallels and projections there might be for people of faith here in the Twin Cities in this time, and offer insights on how, in the wake of George Floyd's murder, God might be calling the church. We will follow this on Tuesday, October the 20th at 7 p.m., where we invite you to join a live webinar with Dr. Rodrigues for a deeper dive into this topic and an opportunity to ask him questions. The interview will be hosted by Westminster's own Vivian Nelsen. If you would like to participate, please contact Maheen Hamilton. We do hope you'll join us. That session will be rebroadcast during the Adult Education Hour on October the 25th. Dr. Rodrigues, welcome.
Well, welcome, Leon. It's so good to see you again. And I'm so delighted you've joined us, our merry band at the seminary. Yeah, it's been, a long time. So I want to ask you to introduce yourself to our folks not just the usual stuff, but that too, but also, tell us about your faith and what makes this talk relevant to the congregation. So.
Yeah, thanks, Vivian. First of all, just appreciate being invited to speak to the folks at Westminster Presbyterian Church, a church I've always admired and have visited a couple of times to hear special speakers at the town hall forums, and also attended a couple of events in your beautiful building and parked downstairs in the underground garage, which is great when you're downtown Minneapolis.
Yeah, absolutely.
So thank you. My name is Leon Rodrigues, and it is often in my culture very difficult to introduce ourselves without introducing those on whose shoulders we stand on. So I'm deeply indebted to those who made amazing sacrifices for me to be the person I am and to be able to introduce myself to you today. So when you meet me, you're meeting all of those who came before me. But I live in St. Paul. I've been living here for close to 20 years, and prior to that in Minneapolis, where I actually started off as a graduate student. I was born and raised in South Africa, and I came to the United States 25 years ago. It'll be 26 soon, as a graduate student. Came to do my doctoral studies at the University of Minnesota. And I subsequently lived in the Twin Cities as an immigrant, as a professional, and as an academic. And my heritage, a lot of people ask me about my last name. I am African, but I am also African American. Yes. And so I always have to explain that. But I'm not Hispanic, but I have a last name like that. My mother's grandfather was born in Jamaica and came to the United States, and we think as a sharecropper. And he somehow landed on the merchant ships, which used to travel to England, and a ship that traveled to South Africa. And when he got to South Africa, I thought that he might have felt this is a great place to be, like many African Americans who travel with me to South Africa just love being there. And he settled there and married a woman from St. Helena, the island of St. Helena. And that is my maternal side. So some of the documents that we have found is of my mom's grandfather, my great-grandfather, having come from the United States. My father's side is indigenous. His mother was an indigenous woman from the Rodrigues tribe, and his father was Portuguese. So thus, the last name of Rodrigues.
Mhm.
As a young child, I grew up under the Apartheid System, and I think some of you might know that that was a system of segregation in South Africa. Part of growing up in that system was living in poverty because I came from an oppressed group, and life didn't seem harsh to me as a young child. It just seemed like that was life. Played with my friends, didn't have much, but enjoyed life until one day I went with my dad to the beach. We lived very close to the ocean, and my dad used to take me for walks. And I was old enough to say to my dad, when I saw some kids playing on water slides and swings and running around and just laughing and chasing each other and jumping in the water, and I wanted to join them. My father said, "No, you can't." Well, as a little kid, you push your parents. And I said, "No, but I want to." And I probably threw a tantrum or something, and my dad just seemed to get more and more angry with me. And then he saw a policeman and he said, "He will arrest you because your sin is the color of your skin." And I didn't know what it meant at the time, but I could hear in my dad's voice that I probably should relent. And so we completed our walk and went home. As I got a little older, I was in elementary school with a very good friend. And we were so close that I would spend some weekends at their home. And one weekend happened to be a big holiday the next day. So I slept over, and his mom said to me the next morning, "We're getting up early and we're going on a picnic." And I was so excited. I was going with the family on a picnic. Well, my friend Thomas was very light-skinned, and his mom, I didn't realize it at the time, was a white woman, but they identified as, we would say in South Africa, colored people.
Mhm.
But they could actually access some of the facilities for white families or for white people.
Mhm.
So I went along on the picnic, and we went to a resort that was for whites only. And as we got there, as a young kid, it didn't mean anything to me when I saw the signage for whites only. And I got out of the car, we carried baskets of food and all sorts of goodies, and we walked to a little entrance. And as we got to the entrance, we were stopped. And everybody was allowed in, but the guard said I could not go in. And I could see the concern on my friend's mom's face, and I saw her get into a conversation with the guard, and there was a bit of a back and forth. And eventually she came to me and she said to me that I should just play in a little pool, just a little tidal pool outside of the resort. And as soon as it is time to eat, they will bring me some food. So I stayed and I played in the little tidal pool and didn't think much of it until years later I realized that the family could pass and they could go in. And because of my skin color, I was not allowed to go into that. So that's the history I bring. I came to the United States. I was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. I had great expectations of this beautiful country, and had lovely friends and professors at the university. But something that really struck me was in my class, there were not many people who looked like me. There were not many professors that I met in my graduate program that were people of color. And several of the students who were students of color seemed to drop out along the way. So I was always a little puzzled about that. But I was here on a mission. I had to complete my degree. I worked really hard. I had lots of good support from my family, from some of my professors, but very quickly realized that even in the United States, you have a divided society. My faith journey has been as a 17-year-old, even though I had been raised as a Catholic boy and had done everything the church required me to do, from baptism to first Holy Communion to being confirmed. At the age of 17, I went to a Christian Bible camp. And I heard about the gospel in a way that I'd never heard before. The gospel seemed to be something very personal, seemed to be something that was important, and seemed to be something, not that it wasn't important before, but seemed so personally important for living a life that one could look back on and feel you have been part of a community and you've made a contribution to that community. And then also in that time, I wanted to go to heaven. Even though as a Catholic boy, I always believed I was going to heaven, but it seemed like there was a step I needed to take, sort of type of an insurance policy. If I didn't take that step, I was not likely to go to heaven.
And what was that?
So the missionaries who ran the camp said we had to confess Jesus Christ and accept him as Lord and Savior, and that would seal the deal.
Okay.
So I did that.
You did that. Okay.
Yep. So that was taken care of. But it is subsequent to that I began reading the Bible, that I began attending Bible studies, that I began fellowshipping with people, that I realized this journey was not just one of sealing the deal. This was a journey of returning back to what God had intended for us, and that we had drifted off. And we had gone our own way, and we had been left to our own devices, which just didn't seem to work. And ever since the age of 17, I've always been involved as a Christian. I've grown, I've imparted those values to others, including to my family. I later joined a church after I got married, and I was very involved in teaching Sunday school and youth classes and parenting classes to adults, and truly enjoyed Bible study, playing music in the church, and continued to build my faith and to rest on some of the most important theological principles that we have as Christians. But I also at the same time realized that there was something going on in our society, that there was an inequality, that there was an oppression in our society. And then began to question that. But from a biblical perspective, I realized that it was not right to hate others.
Yeah.
Yet I had seen so much hatred for my family, for people who looked like me, and even derogatory names, and being rejected, not able to get onto buses that were for whites only. And I realized that there was something wrong with our society.
You're talking about South Africa, right?
I'm talking about South African society. Yeah. So I hope that gives you an idea of who I am. And then your question about, why is this relevant to this congregation?
Mhm.
I've lived in the Twin Cities for a little more than half of my life.
Mhm.
And I have seen the inequalities in this society. I work in higher education, and I've seen the challenges that students who are not white face. I've seen the disparities. I've worked even in Minnesota government, in state government, and I've seen the disparities. I've seen how privilege is withheld from some groups and provided for others almost automatically. And
Mhm.
of course, with what has happened in our cities, with the George Floyd murders, the protests, I just cannot overlook the fact that as Christians, I think we've been a little lethargic.
Hmm. Now I want to press that for a bit, but I want
Sure.
to stop for a minute and say to our folks that in the 50s, Dr. King had. I grew up. I was born in Selma, Alabama, and so he made a comment about, and it was carried all over, about America's apartheid. And my Lord, people went crazy. And what they didn't know is that folks came from South Africa to Alabama and other southern states to see how our segregation was set up. And your system was based on our system. And, all the different offices that you have, to make sure people are not drinking in the wrong fountains and going in the wrong doors and all that sort of thing. That's our system. And so, of course, this isn't my talk, but you and I both know that all those kinds of things are not going to vanish in a short time in a system.
Yes, yes.
Which brings me to another question, and it's kind of out of order. So I'll let you go wherever it was you were wanting to go, but I do want to get back to the system question.
Sure.
Okay, so the tell me about in the Gospel of Jesus Christ, both the Old and New Testament, talk about justice
Yeah.
endlessly, and about charity and not in the old, in our sense of charity, but charity toward the widow, the homeless, etc. And so, having said that, what do you feel that the church has done to fulfill this role?
Mm-hmm. So in South Africa, the church was segregated.
Mm. Like
So the
here.
church, yes. So the churches I attended were poor. Ministers weren't receiving much. My dad was a pastor,
Okay,
never took a salary. The church couldn't afford it.
amazing.
He was bivocational.
Mm-hmm.
Very little facilities. Church building was just a square room, pretty much. Very little resources in the church. But a place where I felt my faith grew.
Okay.
Coming to the United States, I realized that the church is also segregated in the United States. Even though I've gone to several diverse churches,
Mm-hmm.
they are segregated in two ways. One is we have the suburban urban divide.
Mm-hmm.
When I go to churches in the suburban areas, they look like university campuses.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
When I go to churches in the urban areas, like in North Minneapolis
Mm-hmm.
or Southeast Minneapolis, where I used to live, the churches have older buildings.
Yep.
You can see they need repair.
Mm-hmm.
There's one person that tries to do everything. They don't have the staff.
Mm-hmm.
that I see in other churches. They don't even have the budgets that I've seen in some churches. So the segregation might not be the kind of legal segregation that we saw in South Africa under apartheid, but there is a whole different type of economic and social separation in the United States. So what does the gospel call us to? The gospel calls us, as you mentioned, to justice. How did this come to be the way it is? So I want to go back to what you said earlier about South Africans coming to the United States to learn about how to enforce this system of segregation.
Mm-hmm.
In 1991, I visited the United States and I stayed on a native reservation in South Dakota.
Okay, which one?
Called the Rosebud Reservation.
Rosebud, I know it well, yes.
And I lived with the Broken Leg family.
I know them well too. Martin
Yes.
is a friend, yes.
Martin is a friend of mine who came to South Africa and invited me to stay with his parents.
Mhm.
And his dad was an Episcopal minister.
Right.
And I lived there for 3 weeks. And the conditions that I saw was appalling. It felt like I was back in South Africa. I was shocked to find something like that in the United States. And these were Jesus-loving people, but they lived in the worst of circumstances. Some years later, I worked for the University of Minnesota Extension Service, and I went to a reservation up north, the White Earth Reservation. And I was accompanied with a group of colleagues. We were going to do an evaluation project at the reservation, which was part of a project to partner with the reservation. And a couple of people from the reservation, people who were in leadership, spoke that morning. And then the cultural historian, his name was Andy Favorite, came up next to speak. And he said something like this. He said, "We are sick and tired of being prodded and poked and cut open to see who we are."
Yeah.
And then he went on to say that the federal government brought South African agents. He did not know me sitting in the audience was a South African.
Mm-hmm.
But he said that the federal government had brought these South African agents to teach them how to push people, to immobilize them by pushing them into reserves. And it struck me that was our Bantustans in South Africa,
Exactly.
called the homelands.
Well,
But they were reservations.
they are.
And I was shocked to even learn that South African government bureaucrats came to the United States to learn how to enforce those homelands and the pass system.
Yep.
And if you know South African history, you'll know that the pass system was based on control of people's movement, was also the protest at Sharpeville in 1961, because people refused to carry those passes, because those passes guaranteed harassment.
Mm-hmm.
That's a question you would be asked.
Leon, just say a little bit more about the pass system, would you?
Yeah, so in South Africa, we had what was called the Population Registration Act. And under the Population Registration Act, you had to get an identity document.
Mm-hmm.
And that identity document would identify not only your name and your address, but which racial group you were registered in. We had a racial classification.
Mm-hmm.
And certain racial groups could not enter certain areas because we also had what was known as the Group Areas Act. So I could not go from St. Paul to Edina if Edina was regarded as a white area. The very first thing that a police officer would stop me and say, where is your identity document, or where is your pass? And if my pass was not stamped to authorize me to be in that area, I would be arrested.
Mm-hmm.
And so the pass system controlled people's movement. So you could not find a job in an area if you did not have a stamped pass. And if you did find a job, you had to go and get your identity document stamped that you now had approval, almost like a visa. You now had approval. Now, but this is city to city, right? You couldn't even move from one city to the next. And if you look at old pictures of South African apartheid, you will see no non-whites, or non-whites not allowed. So there were always these boards. As children, we would travel on the bus and we'd see these boards. So the pass system regulated movement and said that non-whites could only live in certain areas, and they could only travel for work purposes. Now, a lot of my aunts and my grandmother all were domestic servants. So they were allowed to travel to the wealthy white homes where they worked. But if you've seen The Help, if you took a scene from The Help, you took the little white kids to the park, you could get harassed by the police who wanted to know, what are you doing there? And that was very similar to the experiences of my grandmother and others.
Isn't it amazing how intertwined these systems are in countries that are very vocal about their faith and about being, created by God and all of that. So it does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Well, that is the evil of racism. It is worldwide.
Dare we say it's sin? Can we say that?
We could say it's sin. It is definitely sin.
All right.
And yet, South Africa always exclaimed, the South African government said, we are a Christian government. When they were fighting to keep the Cubans and to keep the Angolans out of South Africa, they called them communists. And anything that was opposed to the government, just as in the United States, is called communist, which was synonymous with saying people who don't believe in God. Yet, if they stood on those biblical principles, they were not practicing them, because apartheid was actually founded on the grounds of the University of Stellenbosch's School of Theology.
Stop. Really? Wait. Go back.
Yes. So South African apartheid was founded on the grounds of the School of Theology of the University of Stellenbosch. So what happened is Stellenbosch is a wine-producing area. And farmers had access to a lot of cheap labor. One of the ways in which the white farmers looked at the natives, the laborers, was to see them as heathens. They were heathens because they were uncultured. And if they believed in the gospel of Jesus Christ, that would redeem their souls. And that would make them then better people. And that story, I'm sure, is very familiar to you, even in the time of slavery in the United States.
Absolutely. The irony is, excuse me for interrupting you, but the irony, I just want to say, oh my Lord, really? Oh, it's just, it's hard to hear that a religious institution is the birthplace.
So the farmers then, after they had converted these laborers, I can use another name, I can call them slaves if that's the wish, but the laborers then, having accepted Christ, would come on a Sunday because part of our Christian tradition is to go to worship on a Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a problem. If they came to worship, they couldn't take communion from the same utensils as the white farming community.
Yeah.
And so this was a dilemma for the farmers because they believed in the inferiority
Mm-hmm.
of these non-white laborers who they exploited and who they exposed to just the most horrible living conditions and completely underpaid them. So when we talk about justice, you think about that.
Mm-hmm.
And you think about the fact that they could not sit in the same circle around the table of Jesus Christ, which unites us, which
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said, do this in memory of me. And it's such a violation of what Jesus called us to do, that the farmers had to find another way to ensure that these people remain so-called Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And that led to the founding of what was called the Dutch Reformed Mission Church.
Wow.
So the state church was the Dutch Reformed Church. The seminary or the School of Theology at the University of Stellenbosch was a Dutch Reformed School of Theology.
Mm-hmm.
And they had the non-white church being the daughter church. So if we think about racial hierarchy, the mother church was superior. The daughter church is for inferior people or lesser people.
We had that same, and to some degree still now, system where we have the mission church, which is the smaller, poorer church, and then the larger churches, the white churches,
Right.
that have the resources, let's put it that way. And
Yeah.
I still want to get around to this word systems, because I think it does play into this, into the very way in which things are ordered, if you will.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And those systems have rules.
Mhm.
And so it is the enforcement of those rules by whoever imposes that system. So in South Africa, we had all these rules. The rules were no non-whites can enter this facility. No non-white can ride on this train, on this bus, or no non-white can live in this community.
Mhm.
But those rules were not only enforced by the authorities who created and maintained those systems, they were also enforced by the average white person.
Say more.
So when I got onto a train,
Mhm.
I was a young child, probably around 12, 13, and I used to go to a Saturday afternoon youth group at my school, which was a train ride away from home. And on a Saturday, there was only 3 trains, one in the morning, one around lunchtime, and one in the afternoon at about 3.
Mhm.
And one day my youth group ended a little late, but it was very close to the railway station. So I was able to see that day that the train is coming along because I could hear it whistling.
Mhm.
And I ran, I said goodbye to my friends, and I dashed. And I ran up the stairs to cross over to the next platform where the train was going to pull in. But I was a little too slow because people had gotten off the train and I couldn't get through the crowd fast enough to board the train. By the time I got to the bottom of the stairs of the platform, I could only jump onto the last coach on the train,
Mhm.
which happened to be a white coach.
Oh boy.
As I got into that coach, hoping that at the next station I could get off
Mhm.
and get onto the non-white coach
Mhm.
without missing the train, because if I had missed that train, I would have to walk home and it would take me probably about 5 or 6 hours to get
Oh
home.
goodness. Oh my.
And I was a little kid. I was very afraid.
Mhm.
that walking home could be dangerous.
Oh, yes, of course.
And therefore, I had to make every attempt to get on the phone,
Yeah.
to get on the train.
Yeah.
Well, I got onto this coach, and as I got in, all of the white people, I had never seen such hatred, such venom,
Mm.
telling me, why am I in that coach?
Hmm.
Almost pushing me out the door
Oh, my goodness.
of a moving train.
Wow.
And I just stood there holding onto a metal bar as tight as I could, crying, being slapped, being told I was this and I was that, being insulted. And I'm a 12, 13-year-old child.
That's
As soon as I got to the next station, I was pushed out
Oh, boy.
and happened to be able to run crying to get to the non-white coach.
What a story.
So the system is not only kept in place by the authorities who have created this evil system, it is also kept in place by those who regard themselves as privileged and as powerful to be able to control the lives of oppressed people.
No. Well, it's not just an idea, it's a reality.
Yes.
I mean, it's very real.
Yeah. And I tell these stories because I see a lot of that happening in the United States. I do see organizational discrimination.
Mhm.
Now, we have laws that we can use in order to sue or to get justice in the courts. But very often the onus is on the person experiencing the discrimination to prove their case. And I can tell you, Vivian, I've been in this field for a long time. Many people of color are just too tired to want to go through that, or are afraid they will continue to be victimized.
And in many cases, they will be. That's why there are rules about retaliation.
Yes.
But that's hard to prove. And the other thing is, who's got not only the money, but the time that it takes to do this. I did this with my institution many years ago as a young woman, and there were 3 of us who were in the lawsuit together. By the way, we won, but life was pretty tough for us after we won. People stopped speaking to us, and it was really interesting.
Yes.
As we say in Minnesota, interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. The interesting thing about the United States is that you do have these laws. We never had laws to protect us in South Africa. The laws were always stacked against us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
All of the police were mostly white, or if there were non-white police, they were subservient to white commanding officers and police chiefs. The judges, the court system was all white. You can just go back to look at Nelson Mandela's trial, the Rivonia trials, and you can see his debate with a white judge and the attitude of the white judge, the racist attitude of the white judge. So these things happened, they continue to happen, but racism has also become much more sophisticated. We don't have to put up the signs anymore. But as you and I know, it is still there, even in the church.
Let's just go with that for a moment, because I have 2 questions really about that. And one is about, the systemic part of it. How does that look? What is that really? And then, where in your faith, where did you find the courage to be the man that you are? Yeah.
So I went to college at what is known as the University of the Western Cape. It was not It's not the college of my choosing. I wanted to go to medical school at the University of Witwatersrand, which was a bus ride from my home.
Okay.
But in order to go to a white school, I had to apply to the Minister of Justice.
Isn't that an odd phrase? The Minister of Justice. I'm sorry.
That's what it was called, the Minister of Justice, who, because of violating the law, a non-white wanting to go to a white school. But the school did have a system where they took in 10 non-whites per year. And I did not get approval. The minister wrote to me and said that I was not approved to go. So I had to go to a college of my own racial group. So I always tell people I've always gone to an HBCU.
Now you have to explain what that is. Yeah.
So that's what you call it in the United States, historical Black colleges and universities, which were established so that non-whites could get an education in this country, so that they could get an education without the discrimination.
Right. That was my grandmother taught. There was only one Lutheran historical Black college, and it was in Selma.
Yes.
And my grandmother taught at it, my dad, and my mom.
Wow.
Yeah, so it was at the end of a dirt road.
Right.
I'm
very happy that I went to an HBCU.
Yeah.
Because I had professors who looked like me. I'd never seen that before. I didn't think a non-white person could even hold a degree.
Yeah.
But I was such a good reader as a kid that I read everything. So I was reading books, and I had such an imagination. I wanted to be a professional person, no matter what it was going to take. The problem, however, was nobody in my family had ever gone to college. I was first generation college goer.
Okay.
And I don't know if I would have persevered if I had gone to this white school as a token. And so going to a Black college meant professors who had similar experiences to mine. And think about this even in the church, when you have youth workers and youth counselors and youth ministers, how are they a role model to the kids of color? Do they understand the experiences of those children? And now that we also have Minnesota having such a great group of immigrant people coming to our churches, how do we understand difference? How do we understand the value system that they bring? And I found that in my college, that there were many students who came from similar circumstances to mine. We all had lived in poverty. We all had struggled. So getting to the next step on the ladder meant certain amount of psychological energy and a certain will to get to the next step of the ladder. Because for us, disparaging circumstances made us despondent. So it was very easy to give up. And every year I saw kids give up. All the way from 9th grade, I saw kids drop out of school in droves. We were only 4 students who graduated from high school. Wow. Only 4, and one is my wife.
Oh my goodness, that's interesting. I want to talk about that, because you talked about this earlier. Being, I worked in the graduate school at the university. To see students of color drop out, there is that psychological pressure. It's hard being the only one in a class. And I was the only one in my division. I didn't know that until I went to complain to the dean that I was so tired of just being the only one in my class. What was going on? And he said, "You're the only one in the division." So I was like,
Yeah.
"Okay, I guess I quit complaining now." But anyway, the long and short of that is that it comes true that our kids in our African American students have huge debt loads.
Yeah.
Huge debt loads.
Yeah.
And many of them have to drop out and work.
Yeah.
So, so you can pay the rent and
Yeah.
so forth and so on. But
Well, I do want to come back to your question though.
Yep.
Because my campus chaplain
Mhm.
was Reverend Dr. Alan Bussack.
Wow. Get out of here. Really?
Yes.
Oh, man.
And Reverend Bussack had just come back from the Netherlands.
Yeah.
After getting his doctorate there.
Mm-hmm.
And Reverend Bussack was a member of the Dutch Reformed Mission Church.
Yeah. Yeah.
And our school had the seminary of the mission church. And I was great friends with all of the theological students, even though I did not study. I studied sociology. I didn't go to the seminary there.
Mm-hmm.
And I hung out with those guys who were being mentored by Alan Bussack because he was our campus chaplain, ran all the campus services and groups and so forth. He was also on the board of a campsite that the university owned, which was just tremendous learning experiences for us. For the very first time, I learned about the gospel. I learned about the Old Testament. I learned to read books around the oppression of people and what liberation meant. And that is not the kind of gospel I have heard in the white church. For me, joining the white church meant I had to leave that aside, even though it was my real circumstantial need to know how to live beyond the experience of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And to hold on to the hope and the promise of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But if you don't give it to me in a way that is relevant to me, everything else sounds like a fairy tale.
Mm-hmm.
And I was tired of a fairy tale gospel.
Mm-hmm.
So when I read scripture, it is very different to how my privileged white colleagues interpret, analyze, decipher the relevance of theology for their lives, as opposed to how I decipher it for my life, and how Alan Bussack did it for us as young Black males coming from oppressed circumstances. This is the challenge to the church. How is your gospel that may be couched in economic affluence or a normative white lived reality and may not be speaking to a African American, Asian American, Hispanic American, or Somali American? Even though we think a lot of Somalis are Muslim, doesn't mean they can't learn about Christ. I have a lot of Ethiopian friends who are deeply devout Christians. They're immigrants. How does our gospel reach them? And that's what I got in my college days.
Mm-hmm.
And that changed my life. After I graduated from college, I went to a large gathering in South Africa. And I wish we could do those kinds of gatherings even here in the United States. It was the precursor, I believe, to what we called koinonia, and subsequently to the Balha Confession, and after that to the kind of multi-ethnic ministries that emerged. But SACLA was founded by two men, a white man and a man of color. Caesar Malabatsi was a Black African man, and Michael Cassidy, also with a professor from the University of South Africa, and I forget his name. He's a missiologist.
What is that?
Missiologist, the study of missions. And they created the South African Christian Leadership Assembly. And it was a 3-day intentional living community conference. We all lived on the fairgrounds in Pretoria, which is the stronghold of apartheid. And every day as we were there and every night as we slept in tents, I was afraid the police were going to arrest us because we were from all different cultural backgrounds, all Christians trying to talk about how do we bring justice to our country. And I was introduced for the first time to the concept of reconciliation.
Ah, yes.
And I left that conference after having met Bishop Tutu, and I lived in a neighborhood not too far from where he had now become the Archbishop, well, he was the Bishop of Cape Town, and invited a lot of us young folk to his home. And we went to his home once a month on a Monday evening, and he mentored us.
Wow.
And it was Bishop Tutu's birthday yesterday, and I was just thinking about how I sat in that room. He had a piano, and I sat next to the piano, and how these men who God had raised, who now had some societal authority, some leadership in our communities, how they poured into us. Young people in the church today need that. They don't only need the gospel, the word of God, and I'm not saying the word of God is not enough, but remember, we're also breaking down evil systems.
Yeah.
And we're giving people something to hold on to.
Right.
And at the same time, we're also giving them the gospel of Jesus Christ. Jesus fed the crowd before preaching to them.
Yes.
And they did not have to think about food on that day. In fact, there was a huge miracle. And we will see huge miracles happen when we can act out the gospel of love, the gospel of brother and sisterhood, the gospel of including, and the gospel that takes us away from an evil system. And we're all socialized into.
Yes.
All of us are socialized into that.
Which brings me to that question I've been wanting to ask all along, but you've been answering it. And that is about, the term systemic racism has now been politicized. So let's just put that aside and just tell me and our friends here, what systemic racism really is. You've been describing it all along.
Yes. You've heard me talk about the past system, the Group Areas Act, all of that, and then even coming to the United States, finding a higher concentration of people of color living in disadvantaged or even neglected and forgotten communities. So structurally, we see these kinds of inequalities, and we know that redlining in the United States was something that was practiced to ensure keeping people of color out of white communities. The origin of the suburbs all happened because of racist ideas and racist policies. We see troops coming back from the Second World War, and these young men being given assistance. They're being given loans, but those loans by the loan officers are channeled more toward white families than to giving Black families a start in life. And there is a very interesting documentary called Race, the Power of an Illusion, that you could see that exemplified. I mean, they show you all the documents and they discuss these concepts in there, but even there are so many books written about redlining and about how we created a structural system
Mhm.
to ensure privilege and advantage for white brothers and sisters or white siblings,
Mhm.
and the barriers to those who are people of color. And everything all the way back to the genocide of Native Americans were part of creating this structure. There's a very interesting story about Chief Red Jacket. A missionary went out to meet with the Native American tribes. They had settled on the land and they wanted to have good relationships with these tribes. So the missionary went out and talked to the tribes. They gathered all the chiefs from the different areas, brought them together, and the missionary spoke about Jesus to them. And they listened very intently and as he spoke. And then he asked them eventually, would you accept Jesus? And the chiefs said, well, give us a minute. We want to just go and talk amongst ourselves. And when we come back, we'll give you an answer. Well, sometimes when we convey the gospel, we convey it in an individualistic way. And for these groups, the Native Americans, they were used to a collective culture, collective decision making.
Right.
And they were used to following the leadership of these very ethical men and women in their communities. Our chiefs were mostly male, but people were used to following the elder leadership. And so the chiefs went and they deliberated for a while. And then they came back, and Chief Red Jacket was their spokesman.
Mm-hmm.
And as he came back, he said to the missionary, brother, thank you for making the time, for taking this journey to travel to us, to tell us about Jesus. And they said, if your Jesus is so good, why do your people not follow him and his teachings?
Hmm.
And the missionary said, oh, yes, we do. And the chief said, well, if you are following the teachings of Jesus, you would not steal and rob us of our land. So until your people live according to Jesus, then we will accept your Jesus.
Amazing.
I tell that story because we think that our systems work for everybody, because the system was shaped to serve the interests of white people in this country, just as it was in South Africa. The big difference between South Africa and the United States is that the non-white, and I don't like the term, but I'm going to use it for illustrative purposes.
Mm-hmm.
The non-white population is 90% of the population.
Hmm.
So we were the majority,
Yeah.
and whites were the minority. They were under 10%.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In the United States, you have the inverse of that.
Yes, of course. Oh, Leon, we could talk into the evening, but we are just rounding up on the end of our talk, and I didn't get half of the questions I was going to ask you about. So I want everybody to know that you're going to have a chance to ask your own questions of Leon on the 20th. And so you need to contact Hamilton for webinar information to participate. And it's going to be at 7 p.m. Now is that the 20th? Let's see here. Do you remember, Leon?
Rachel is probably still on. She could give us the
Are you
answer.
still on?
I am, yes. That is Tuesday the 20th, which is the day, 2 days after this talk is going to be broadcast on Sunday morning. So Maheen will have all of the webinar info for anybody who would like to join that conversation.
Okay, thank you so much, Leon. This has been just a gift. I'm so appreciative that we got a chance to connect like this. So and let the other people listen in.
Yeah. Thank you. God
And
bless you. So
you
thrilled
too.
to be with you guys. Look
Yes,
forward
you
to
too.
the questions.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.